I'm Henny B, and welcome to the World War I Stories podcast, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. Some scenes in these stories may be too graphic for sensitive listeners, so listener discretion is advised. Today's episode, Carrying the Crown. The whistle of the tea kettle shattered his reverie. When lost in thought, it often took a sharp noise like that to pull him back to reality. He turned to see Anna preparing to pour water into the 3 mugs she'd been making tea in. On the floor in front of him, Liesel, his 6-year-old daughter, sat engrossed in a book. Eric Bauer felt a deep gratitude for his little family and the 3rd-story apartment they inhabited with its view over the Danube River in Vienna. He sighed heavily as he rose from the chair and made his way to the small table in the room that served as a kitchen and dining area. Liesel, I think it's tea time, my dear. The precocious child rose from the floor, tossing the book aside in a haphazard manner. Coming, Papa. The atmosphere in the home was a solemn one. Every Austrian was dealing with the tragedy that had happened 3 days before in their own way. Eric himself was mortified and scared. He felt like the repercussions of what happened in Sarajevo could be dire, but nobody knew how dire, not even him. Anna handed him his tea, her eyes reflecting the same unspoken worry that hung over them all. It's hard to believe, isn't it? She murmured, almost to herself. Eric nodded, taking a sip of the hot liquid. Yes, it is. The world feels different today. Liesel, sensing the tension but not fully understanding it, looked between her parents. What happened, Papa? Why is everyone so sad? Eric exchanged a glance with Anna, who gave a slight nod. Something very bad happened, sweetheart. A very important person was hurt, and now everyone's worried. Liesel frowned, her young mind processing the information. Will everything be okay? We hope so, Anna said gently, brushing a stray lock of hair from Liesel's forehead. But right now, we must be strong and support each other. The next morning, as he packed his bag and kissed Anna and Liesel goodbye as they slept, he felt the responsibility settle on his shoulders. As a train conductor, he had been all over Europe taking cargo to various places and people on holiday. But this trip would be vastly different. He would be taking very few people with him and returning with a cargo that carried the weight of a nation's grief. Eric walked outside into the still darkness of the morning, the moon low on the horizon. He looked around the neighborhood, got on his bike, and started his 8-minute journey to the train yard where he was set to take the most important trip of his life so far. The streets of Vienna were quiet this morning. Sometimes the early risers and vendors could be seen setting up their stalls in the darkness. Today, there was a somber stillness in the air. The news from Sarajevo had cast a shadow over the entire city, and Eric could feel it pressing down on him as he pedaled through the streets. As he approached the train yard, the familiar clank of metal and hiss of steam greeted him. The sight of the massive iron beast that he had guided countless times brought a small measure of comfort. Yet the train he was to take today stood apart from the rest, its polished exterior gleaming even under the low light of the moon, a stark reminder of the solemn task ahead. Eric dismounted his bike and walked it over to the small shed where he usually left it. He took a deep breath, trying to stay his nerve. He could see a few other railway workers gathered near the train, their faces reflecting the same mix of apprehension and determination that he felt. Morning, Eric, called out Carl as Eric approached. Quite the day, isn't it? Carl was the fireman aboard the train, responsible for shoveling coal into the firebox to generate steam, which powered the locomotive and propelled it forward. Morning, Carl, Eric replied, forcing a smile. Yes, quite the day. The 2 men exchanged a brief, understanding nod before turning their attention to the train. They had a lot of checks to go through before departure. He began with a thorough inspection of the locomotive, checking the engine, the brakes, and the coupling mechanism. Carl and the other engineers were already busy inspecting the wheels and axles, ensuring everything was properly lubricated and in working order. They tested the communication systems, making sure the whistle and bell were functioning correctly. Eric moved on to the carriages, inspecting the interiors to ensure that they were clean and orderly. He checked the secure compartments where the precious cargo would be placed on the return journey. Everything had to be impeccable. "How's it looking, Eric?" asked Joseph, another member of the crew, as he finished his own set of checks. "Everything seems to be in order," Eric replied, his voice steady. "Let's make sure we keep it that way." With the checks completed, Eric, Carl, and Joseph went over the route, potential hazards, and the importance of this trip. He emphasized the need for vigilance and cooperation, knowing that any mistake could have serious consequences. They discussed the timetable and special instructions, ensuring everyone was on the same page. With all of that complete, a small military entourage was led on board, along with some serving staff. Eric and Carl took their places in the engine of the train, and Joseph took up his seat in the caboose. Eric took a final look around the tracks, ensuring everything was clear in front of the train. Satisfied that all was in order, he pushed the lever that would project the train forward. The engine roared to life, and the train began to move with a steady, rhythmic chug. As the train picked up speed, Eric felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. The familiar sounds of the locomotive, the clanking of metal, the hiss of steam were both comforting and a reminder of the responsibility he bore. He glanced at Carl, who gave him a reassuring nod. The train chugged out of the yard, eventually leaving the city of Vienna behind. The urban landscape gradually gave way to the rolling countryside, the newly rising sun starting to cast long shadows over the fields. This was not the first time he had taken this route to Trieste, the bustling port city on the Adriatic Sea, but it was the first, and hopefully the only time, he would go anywhere to retrieve and escort home the body of a man who would be king. Like many Austrians, he had heard of Franz Ferdinand, but did not know much about him. The shocking news that the Archduke and his wife had been assassinated had arrived just 2 days ago. Yesterday, Eric learned he would be the person to bring their bodies back to Vienna. As he was leaving Vienna, the bodies were being transported by boat to Trieste after traveling from Sarajevo to the port of Metkovic. From Trieste, Eric would guide the train back to Vienna for a state funeral. As Eric looked at his surroundings, paying special attention to the tracks ahead of him, last thing he wanted was to be caught off guard by debris or even an animal blocking the tracks, he wondered aloud, "We have to respond, no?" Carl, caught off guard by the question, shoveled a heap of coal into the firebox and turned to Eric. "Of course. One cannot allow the heir to the throne to be assassinated and do nothing about it." Letting out a heavy sigh, Eric continued to look off into the distance. "It all feels so surreal. We went from normal to, well, not normal in 3 short days." Carl sat in his designated seat from which he monitored the coal level in the firebox. "I have a sinking suspicion that we may be headed for war, my friend." Eric contemplated this for only a moment. "That's what I'm afraid of." For the next 11 hours, Eric watched the landscape pass him by. The hills, the fields, the occasional farmhouse and town or village. Everything seemed so eerily quiet outside of the rumble of the train. The sun was starting its descent in the high sky as they pulled into the station at Trieste. Eric spread a blanket out in the car that would soon house the bodies of the would-be king and queen of Austria-Hungary and tried to nap. Sleep eluded him. His mind raced with the thoughts of the journey ahead. The weight of the task felt heavier now that they had arrived. He could almost hear the whispers of the crowd that would gather to pay their respects, the murmurs of grief and disbelief echoing in his ears. As he lay there, the rhythmic clatter of the train faded into the background, replaced by the distant sounds of the bustling port. The smell of salt water wafted through the open windows, mingled with the scent of coal smoke. It was a stark reminder that life continued outside, even as tragedy loomed within the train. Eric closed his eyes, trying to find solace in the darkness. He thought of Anna and Liesel, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of their home. He could picture Liesel's curious eyes, always eager to learn, and Anna's gentle smile that could ease any burden. A soft knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. It was Carl, his expression serious. "They're here." Eric got up and started to fold the blanket. "Give me just a second." He finished folding the blanket and stored it away. He opened the door and hopped out of the car. The sun was dipping below the horizon now. In an hour, it would be dark. "Keep the door open. It'll be faster," he said to Carl. Together, they watched as a procession of vehicles entered the train yard, including a military truck. They kept their distance from the doorway, observing as the military entourage that had accompanied the bodies sprang into action. With practical efficiency, they transferred the two coffins from the truck to the train car. Once that was completed, the truck moved forward and another vehicle pulled up. They watched again as the military personnel carefully removed two empty glass-topped coffins from the truck and placed them into the same car. These coffins had been used for the public viewing of the Archduke and his wife, who had lain in state at Sarajevo City Hall for several days following their assassination. All in all, they had been in Trieste for 4 hours. The last two were spent watching the Austrian military load and later prepare the bodies themselves for the last leg of their final journey. The military officials said nothing to Eric or Karl. Joseph had never even emerged from the caboose. Eric figured he must have been able to sleep. Lucky guy, he thought. When they were finished, a military officer glanced over at Eric and nodded as he closed the car door from the inside and disappeared. I guess that's our cue. Karl had seen this too and was already boarding the engine. Yep. Eric looked at his timepiece. 10:30 p.m. He boarded the train, took his seat, and pushed the lever forward, feeling the train lurch as it officially began its funeral procession to Vienna. The oil lamp in the cab swayed back and forth as the train lumbered through the darkness, this time with the fields, hills, and occasional farmhouse passing by unseen. Aside from the rattling of the train's wheels and the sound of coal being shoveled into the firebox by Karl, there was complete silence. Eric never spoke when navigating the tracks at night. The darkness demanded his full attention. He had to be more alert than ever for debris, switches, and other hazards that could threaten the train and its precious cargo. He was careful on normal trips, but this time he was doubly so. After almost 12 hours, he rubbed his eyes as Vienna, and eventually the train station, came into view. Karl, look. Karl got up and stood beside him looking out the front train windows. Would you look at that? Eric was puzzled. How did people know when they would arrive? I guess word travels fast, huh? Guess so. Eric maneuvered the train engine past the station, carefully aligning the significant car, the one carrying the military entourage and the coffins, with the platform. He stepped down from the engine and joined the crowd gathered on the platform. There was no cheering, no celebration, only a heavy silence as the military personnel began unloading the cargo. Karl noticed that the bodies had been placed back into the glass-covered viewing coffins, and as the soldiers carried them by, they were almost close enough for Eric to reach out and touch. They look like they're just sleeping, Karl remarked, approaching from behind. Eventually we all do, my friend. We all do, Eric replied, turning away from the somber scene. He walked toward the shed where he had stored his bike and began his journey home. For the next 3 days, Vienna held many events to commemorate the Archduke and his wife. Eric attended none of them, while Anna and little Liesel attended many. They tried, unsuccessfully, to convince him to join them, but Eric was steadfast in his refusal. He had a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach that something big was going to happen as a result of this. It had been almost a month since Eric brought the bodies back to Vienna. The weight of that journey still hung heavy in the air, even as he sat at dinner with Anna and Liesel, the aroma of sausages and potatoes filling their small apartment. As they ate, Liesel animatedly recounted her day at school, her little hands gesturing wildly. And then, Papa, I told my teacher that I want to be a train conductor just like you. She laughed and said that was a man's job. Eric smiled, his heart swelling with pride. But the joy was tinged with an undercurrent of anxiety. He glanced at Anna, who was quietly serving herself, her brow furrowed in thought. Suddenly, a light knock at the door broke the moment. Anna exchanged a quick glance with Eric, her eyes reflecting a flicker of concern. I'll see who it is, she said, rising from the table. Eric watched her go, his stomach tightening. The atmosphere felt charged, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Moments later, Anna returned, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm. It's Karl, she said, stepping aside to let him in. Karl stood in the doorway, his face pale, holding up a newspaper like a grim trophy. The large headline seemed to leap off the page, screaming for attention. Austria declares war on Serbia. Eric's heart sank. What? He breathed, rising from his chair. Carl, are you sure? Carl stepped further into the room, his voice low and urgent. I just heard it from the station. They're mobilizing the troops. It's official. Eric glanced at Anna and then back at Carl. We're going to get busy. Carl nodded. Won't be able to deploy troops without trains. Later that night, as he and Anna lie in bed, he heard her ask, Will it be dangerous? Will what be dangerous, my love? He asked. Transporting the troops to war. He had never lied to Anna, so he thought carefully about how to answer her. Not at all. Nobody ever targets trains, love. He rolled over and turned down the oil lamp until the flame was extinguished. She curled up in his arms with her head on his chest. That's the first time you've ever lied to me. Thank you. This has been World War I Stories. Thank you for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the show wherever you find this podcast, and don't forget to throw us a rating. Join our Facebook community by searching and liking the official World War I Stories page. You can also join me on Blue Sky, where I go by the handle WW1Stories_NEB. World War I Stories is now featured on Rabbit in Red Radio, with new episodes streaming Monday night at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. They also have all episodes available on demand. Visit rabbitinredradio.com for this and many other independent podcasts. And last but not least, would you like your name read on the show? Become a producer by contributing to our Patreon at patreon.com/World War I Stories. I am very grateful to everyone who downloads and listens to this show. I'm Henny B. See you next time on World War I Stories.